whenever I was in probably 3rd or 4th grade. I used it at school. We used it to communicate by email with relatives, and that was pretty much it.
Probably 7th grade for a BCIS class.
Huh.
7th grade.
About the 8th grade, and I was just in the chat room or whatever, just talking to people.
Communicate.
Probably in like 6th or 7th grade when you go online after class, after school, and play on AIM. So.
Multiple times a day. I'd say probably 10, 20 times a day.
Probably once a week.
5 times a day.
About twice a day.
I probably check it about 3 to 4 times a day.
Probably 4 times a day. I use it for personal and business use though.
Probably about 3 times a week.
5 times a day.
Facebook, I check about 5 times a day. I'm kind of addicted.
I probably check my Facebook about 2 to 3 times a day.
Yeah, for school research in high school and just researching things I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, sometimes I use it as like a starting point to just kind of get general ideas about a subject and then research it further.
Yes, I usually use it just to find out just the basic information on the topic, and I use other references after that.
I use Wikipedia all the time. You know, I'll be watching a TV show and then I'll be like, who's that person and where have I known them from? And then you can go to Wikipedia and find all that stuff. So.
Sometimes it depends. Taking online classes, I find sometimes talking through Blackboard and other mediums, it's not as easy to learn whenever you don't have examples and demonstrations in front of you, but I'm not sure if it makes it better or worse. It's just different that I'm not used to.
Definitely not. I took a music class one time online and I got a 30 on it, and then I took it in person. I got a 97 in it.
Yes, sometimes I learn more from students and can see what their ideas are on some subjects and topics that we read in class.
I think sometimes you can learn more from online discussion because there's probably, you know, you're forced to participate when you do the Blackboard discussions, whereas if you go to class, you don't have to speak necessarily, so you can get more perspectives, but it's also more difficult to understand the person's tone and what they're exactly trying to get out, because it's harder to type what you want to say as opposed to just saying it in person.